So again, everyone that is still coming in, thank you for joining today's session, Scaling Smart, Design a Security Program That Lasts. I am joined by two great speakers, Pete Luban, Field CISO at AttackIQ, and Dan Campos, Head of Security and Compliance at Bubble. They'll walk through how to measure effectiveness in a way leadership trusts, build feedback loops that drive real improvement, and turn long-term risk lists into decisions you can fund and execute. So with that, I'll hand it over to Pete.
Thank you very much, Liz. Hello again, everybody. Thanks for joining. Just a quick note about myself for those who haven't joined us previously. So I'm the field CISO at AttackIQ. I've got 30 years in the biz. Most recently as a CISO for a big financial organization in Austin, Texas. I came over to AttackIQ because I'm a big believer in the products. I've been a customer of the product since just about day one. And it gave me an opportunity to do things a little bit more on the academic side of things and get more involved in the research and the threat intel and all that good stuff. So here I am. So we are in episode 5 of our webinar series this year. We've got one more coming up in December. That's going to be focused on predictions, and we have some super bigwigs who are going to join that. That's going to be really cool. So check that out. And anyway, enough about that. Enough about me. Just a quick disclaimer for everyone. Standard provisions apply. Views and opinions expressed in this webinar are those of the speakers and don't necessarily reflect the views or positions of any entity or corporation or business or governing body, et cetera, et cetera. But I think you all know that. Anyway, now for the important stuff. I am joined by Mr. Dan Campos. Dan and I go way back. We worked together for a number of years at Bridgewater Associates, doing security and doing governance and all that good kind of stuff. And Dan's been pretty busy since then. So Dan, give us a little intro about yourself and why you're so awesome.
Well, we'll see how well I can capture that. I started out as an engineer, like actually on the help desk, right? So that's my background, and kind of worked from there into governance and compliance roles. And so, I've worked in finance, defense, and now at a tech company, basically. Yeah, it was really interesting going from a tech, understanding how things work fundamentally, understanding how threat actors work, and then connecting that to the business side of things. So that's kind of been my journey to now.
Right on. And that's good because that's exactly what we're going to talk about today. So let's get going into some of the subject matter. So as I always like to do, let me set the stage around what it is that we're going to talk about. So, seriously yet anecdotally, we all know as practitioners in this space that your company's not going to write you the blank check tomorrow. Now, no matter how much we beg for more resources financially and human resource wise, it's just not something that's going to happen. And even if it did, is that going to solve our problems, right? The $1 million converged platforms and all the AI bells and whistles that were being sold through vendors that claim to try and solve some of these problems might, depending on how you feel about it. But they create new ones. They create problems of scale. They create overhead. All these things that need to be managed. Scale has been and always will be a problem in our industry. And as we've seen, you can't people your way out of it. Even if you had that blank check, you can only build horizontally so far. So shrinking budgets, dry hiring pipelines, skill gaps, keep increasing, and we got to deal with that. Who doesn't have to deal with that? The people trying to kill us. The adversary doesn't have institutional problems. They don't have compliance problems. They don't have scale problems. As a matter of fact, they are a scale problem.
Right.
So this is some of the stuff that we're gonna talk about how to deal with today. And again, the point here is, how do we deal with this stuff through the lens of what are the right things? How do we know those are the right things? How do we do it in a cost-effective and efficient manner? And most importantly, and we'll talk about this later, how do we get the enterprise or the regulator or whoever it is to understand the investments that we're making and why those are the right investments to make, and so on. So let's talk about scale. Scale can mean a lot of things. So horizontal scaling, like I just talked about, which is essentially just scaling headcount, hiring people, is just not possible these days anymore. I'm not sure it ever was.
Right.
So, Dan, in your opinion, how does a company either, like in the beginning of its maturity journey or in the middle of its maturity journey manage that problem of scale? And essentially, what are some of the things that you think about in that context?
Yeah. I think as a fundamental thing, you really need to understand what the business is trying to do, like deeply, like what are its main objectives, because risk management is really in context of that. Um, and so I don't think you'd ever want the blank check, because then you're just gonna, you know, draw all these resources and then, you're not going to be that effective. And so if you understand what the company's trying to do, uh, its objectives, uh, its environment, you align everything to that. So I think that is really important. And then from there, you can figure out, okay, this is what the company's trying to do. This is the environment. Um, and you then figure out like how to get the most out of every dollar, basically. Um, so early on in this journey, right? If you understand, these are my compliance requirements, these are the threat actors, then you start with basics and you scale up from there. But you want to be really mindful and smart. I think that the right concept is trade-offs. Like every bit of time you ask of developers and engineers to do something with security, every dollar that's not going to, meeting a business's objective, right? Like it's not security for the sake of security, right? You're
Mhm.
trying to I almost think of it like, yeah, you're making investments, and you're trying to use as little of the pie, so to speak, of money and people, uh, and get the most bang for a buck out of that. So you're gonna have like table stakes compliance type things that you have to do anyways. And compliance isn't necessarily bad. We'll get to that, right? Because there's
Yeah,
that argument, but you build that foundation, which is helpful, and then you understand the actual threats and risks that you're exposed to. Once you know the objectives, what you're exposed to, you basically work from that point of view. So when you're, thinking about what investments to make, what level of maturity, um, that's that's basically like my North Star for how to, you know, think about where to start. And you have to start kind of basic and scale up from there, because if you try and start, super advanced with like, you're talking about like these big dashboards and things, that's not digestible. So that's another, important concept of you got to make sure that as you turn things on, like you can actually process them and do stuff with it.
for sure. No, no, no security program on the planet, you know, didn't start as a collection of spreadsheets and loosely cobbled together risk frameworks because it's a discovery thing. Like
Yeah.
there's a million things that need to be understood. They need to be put into context. And at the end of the day, you're there to drive a business towards its ultimate goal, be it a product or a service or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Um, so sidebar there just for a second, right? Because people have heard me say this all the time, and you've even heard me say this all the time, right? Like, and I like to have polarizing T-shirt slogan things to say all the time because that's how I live my life. But
Right.
you know, compliance is not security. Now I know this is it's a debatable thing.
Yeah.
Like, what are your thoughts on that?
I think it's not one or the other. So I think it's dangerous, I think, uh, to say, yeah, there's a funny thing. It's like threat actors don't care if you're compliant or not. Like, true. Um, so you have to look at it like a compliance framework gives you like a starting prescriptive set of things to do. But all compliance frameworks that I've worked with, even expect you to do things in a risk prioritized fashion. No framework says that like, you can't do that. Um, and so, they start with kind of prescriptive things. They're basic hygiene. And so you take that, but then really you're always thinking about the actual cyber threats, right? Like, and the threat landscape and knowing, for example, like, you got to do your basic hygiene, patching, and all those things. So then you take a compliance framework and you align it to the actual risk, the cyber threat. And so you know, there's like the foundation of prescriptive guidance. And on top of that, you build the dynamic, um, like threat aligned, risk aligned uh, type of controls and maturity. Um, and ultimately, always keeping in mind your compliance requirements, like you have to demonstrate, how you're risk prioritizing and you're still effective. So, basically, you can't just follow compliance frameworks blindly, because all these frameworks don't really factor in context, your
Right.
environment, and your objectives. But like, I'm just thinking about NIST, for example.
Hmm.
It's got all these variables, kind of make your head hurt 'cause you're reading the thing. It's almost like a Mad Libs, right? Like insert this is objective here, and Um, but yeah, I mean they give you that framework. You have to think about your environment and your priorities. So you really, that's why it's not one or the other, right? So um, just try to make it your compliance a foundation, and then on top of that, kind of, you know, you don't have to like necessarily think about those requirements. You just have to think about uh, stopping the adversaries and still making sure you're being efficient about it.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess one could argue if you're doing security right, then compliance is almost an afterthought. And the Mad Libs thing is an excellent analogy. Every time I look at 853, that's a first thing that comes to my head. But so that's perfect, right? Like compliance can be a launch pad, right?
Yeah,
It can be a foundation that you provide context and you prioritize on. And compliance can also be a method of quantification insofar as compliance says must do things, even doesn't tell you exactly what to do or exactly how to
right.
do them. There's a box to check. And you can sort of use that as a method of quantification. So I want to talk about quantification a little bit more because compliance is one thing. There's a whole bunch of other things, right? Um, not a casual topic. I mean,
Yeah,
quantification is one of those, highly debated and arguably either valuable or least valuable things, depending on how you're talking about it. But we could talk about quantification a bunch of different ways. We could talk about, quantification of risk. We could talk about return on investment on controls or third-party solutions. We could talk about control effectivity or effectiveness. These are all methods of quantification. But um, the question is, again, through the lens of maturing a cybersecurity program, like what actually matters in terms of your ability to quantify? Like, what are you trying to measure, and what's the story that you're trying to tell?
yeah, yeah. And connecting it back to the compliance thing for a lot of organizations, compliance is also a business enabler. You can't ignore it. But now we're tying it back to what does the business care about, right? And so you want to try like there's really advanced studies and people who cover quantification. I don't know if you've heard of Richard Searson, I think is how you
Hmm.
pronounce his name, how to measure anything in cybersecurity.
Yep.
Um, and you can take it really far. It's awesome. But like, when you're starting out, I think going back to that principle of, what does that business care about? So you can start with simple things of like percentage of spend or looking at like value at risk. And, at first you might not have those perfect numbers, but you start with these conversations about, um, it's almost like an insurance policy, right? You have a house, it's worth some amount, how much insurance are you taking out on it? Like that percentage, needs to make sense. Like I think about like when you buy a phone and you get those extra insurance plans and you do the math, it's like it's going to be way more than the phone itself. So um, I think being able to boil it down to those terms, and then so you have some percentage of budget and people's time, and these again it depends on the organization and how you measure these things, and you can get like really complicated. But um, then you're talking about, well, are we using these resources efficiently? And then that goes back to, um, how much are we spending in time in terms of people and time and money on compliance basics, um, which, in a way, it's like that's pretty simple. Like you either are compliant or you're not. But then you have the stuff that's like, okay, well, how am I, uh, you know, putting these resources on the most valuable things for the business? And so having that sense and being able to talk about um, understanding the threat landscape, understanding what assets are more valuable and exposed to these threats, um, and then always bringing it back to trade-offs. Like if we have so many resources, what is the best way to place these bets, so to speak, in what we're protecting? Um, and then also being able to talk about, taking risk isn't inherently bad. So that's another important thing of being able to articulate, um, in some areas it makes sense to take risk and it's smart. But that always goes back to the, you know, like higher level, like what's the organization trying to do? And that's how you figure out like where you might want to take risk or not. So, there's a lot of like more prescriptive guidance on what to measure, like, there's like a risk arrival versus risk departure rates, and mean times remediation. And I do think though, and I'll keep bringing it back to one of those like core principles of, understanding the business of what matters to them, understanding the core concepts of alignment and efficiency. And then once you understand the organization, that people um, work from there and be practical about the metrics, right? Like what you can measure, um, again, practically. Um, and because you can get really carried away on measuring, um, but then it doesn't resonate, right? It's like a bunch of numbers with no context. Um, so, that's how I think about it. I think you can start really like just having these conversations, getting some basic numbers and metrics and building as you go. And I think as you mature, now my general principle is the more money and resources you're asking for, like the more precise and quantified you need to be. Um, but the more you can say like this is why we're doing it from both a compliance and cyber risk perspective. This is how it, helps us achieve the company's objectives. Um, and you go from there. But what I found powerful there is like you start talking in these terms and you develop a internal language for that. Then you build the metrics on top of that.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. As an example, in my previous life, um, showing up in the boardroom and trying to, this is a financial company, right? Like these are
Yeah.
Nobel Prize winning economists and so on and so forth. So you want to show up in the boardroom and start talking about return on investment, you could turn around and show them the
Yeah.
door. Like you can't quantify that, right? Like it's
Yeah.
always the struggle that I think we all live through is like, well, you can't quantify something that hasn't happened. Well,
Right.
absolutely you can, but is anybody going to take that seriously, right? So like you had mentioned in there, essentially, I think you're trying to derive essentially like cost of some kind, cost of some sort of loss, right?
Yeah.
Cool. Like losing products or losing IP can be quantified. A reputational risk is a lot more difficult to quantify, and so that becomes a super difficult thing. Um, so so knowing that and sort of understanding the variability of it and understanding some of the challenges behind um, you know letting the folks who give you the resources know that we are maturing and that's okay because XYZ
Mhm.
and we're spending money wisely and using resources wisely and I can show you that because blah blah blah. This is one of those things that boils down to the ability to communicate all of this stuff effectively. Essentially, how do you get the boss, to understand your challenges and understand your vision and your roadmap and understand what's really required to create a forward trajectory and maintain that forward trajectory at a pace that makes sense.
Yeah.
Like, again, as an example, in my previous life, the indicator of success or the indicator of maturation was, hey, how do we compare against our peers in our
Yeah.
industry? And I'm like, that's a friggin' fantastic question. I wish I could tell you, because it's not like I could go knock on Fidelity's door and say, show me
Yeah.
your, open the kimono and tell me like how you guys are doing and how you're doing it. Um, so the question that's baked into there is like, how do you communicate this effectively to the people who are, giving you the resources to do the things that you need to do?
Yeah, it's that trade-off kind of conversation. So why am I not shipping software to secure it? Uh, why am I not spending money on, other things we want to do? Um, you have to, it's going to keep going to like understand what the business is trying to do. Um, and the spending this much makes sense in terms of like, uh, you know, uh, what we need to, the budget that we have, the amount of people that we have. Um, so you really need to build good relationships with the business leaders, deeply understand, um, you know, their mission. When you start out, like you're not going to have super detailed, metrics, but you can start pretty basic and build from there. But try to communicate the risk of something. So, the classic example is, hey, should we just like you need to like patch everything according to CVSS score. Like that's super expensive, as opposed to saying, um, these assets are more exposed. So let's, concentrate there. You don't want to stop there because you don't want like that, crunchy exterior, soft interior type of design. But being able to articulate, why we're spending and where we're spending it. Also, you know, uh, security can sometimes impact like agility of the company, right? Too many gates, right? Like heavy processes, um, and being able to talk about those trade-offs. Like, hey, we have all these control, procedures. They're good, but if it slows down, agility or flexibility, um, that's that's not good, obviously. Um, so yeah, just being able to put it in those terms of trade-offs doesn't make sense. Is it at the right level? And yeah, kind of showing like, okay, we're at this basic level. Like you might not have controls. You might have like a big gap in some areas, and some areas might be good enough. And just being able to communicate, this is how we get to that point and how it matches with the company's current maturity and its strategy. Um, so yeah, I mean that's how you can approach it without some like really complex metrics. And I think it also helps, to know the threat landscape, even just like, being up to speed on the Verizon, DBIR.
Yep.
So it's, okay, like then you know why you're trying to, um, you know, target specific defenses. Um, and another thing is like, showing how you're using your resources efficiently, like always try and like leverage automation, um, spend time in tuning it, think really hard about like who's going to operate, how it's going to work. Um, but if you talk in these terms, I think business leaders are going to be way more receptive because you're not just saying like, hey, we need to patch everything. We need the latest and the best tool. Um, you spend a lot of money. There's a lot of cognitive load, overload, and it's less effective than having something basic, right, that covers your initial level. And so I think those conversations are more, you know, effective when you kind of have that awareness of the company's maturity, and that you're basically spending their money and resources, efficiently.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. There were some things you mentioned there that I want to, give a minute or two of focus on, right? You talked about building relationships, and I think that is a critical concept, and often not one that gets talked about very much. You also said, you know, building that internal language, right? Like a metric doesn't need to come out of a book
Yeah.
and be something that you understand because you're a practitioner, and somebody who's not will not. Like mean time to detect, mean time to resolve. Like we get it.
Right.
These are all sort of industry standard things. But the relationship tied to the language that you speak is absolutely critical. And I can share all of the war stories about the struggles of achieving that. But to heavily synthesize, um, coming into the room with a bunch of dashboards and graphs,
Mhm.
and green is good and red is bad, um, paired with industry statistics, around we stand to lose hundreds of millions of dollars if hypothetical scenario A occurs, blah blah blah, is an extremely rigid, um, way to have that conversation. I guess there are some boards in the world where that kind of stuff works, and those are usually boards that don't want to be there.
Sure.
But the ones who have a vested interest and understand that it is their responsibility, and that you are essentially the manifestation of meeting that responsibility, want to have conversations where they're capable of understanding what it is we're dealing with from a threat standpoint, from a resource commitment standpoint, why vendor X solution will do A, B,
Yeah.
C, et cetera. All of these things cannot be overlooked. And that's why I say in my past, conversations about ROI and this acronym and this acronym didn't get me anywhere. But
Yeah.
but the conversation about, like, hey, look what's going on in the world. Hey, look at
Yeah.
what's going on in our industry, and why it is that we fit some model where we should be concerned about those things,
Yeah.
tends to be a conversation that gets a lot more traction when it comes to, okay, cool, we understand that that's the threat. What are we doing about it? Cool. Now we can talk about, let me show you the program and where it's going and why it's taking those things into account, and so on. So again, absolute business context, also absolute
Mhm.
context about what's going on in the world, in your industry, in your geo, like whatever it is. Like all these things create that language, that I think you can build that on top of. Now, it's a good segue into the next thing I want to ask you about. All right. Um, so we all have a million things to do, or at least it feels that way.
Yeah.
Um, and through the lens of this context, and through the lens of this business awareness, and through the lens of understanding the threat actor and the threat landscape, um, not all of those million things are going to be important. You said it
Yeah.
before, like not all risk is inherently bad.
Right.
And the only way to get to a place where you can manage that is to talk about prioritization.
Yeah.
Big word, like not a fun conversation to have usually. Um, what's important, right? So like what's truly a priority if we're focused on the most efficient path to maturity? Like in your mind, like what does prioritization look like when what you're trying to achieve is not only deal with the most omnipresent risk, but also mature the program at a pace that makes sense for the business, and again go back to being able to communicate that and report on it and do all these other things.
Yeah. That brings to mind too, like at a technical level, like when you're working with engineers, and the development teams, um, you you have to know, in having those relationships, you have to know what people are working on, um, where their time is going, because I'm always going to bring it back to trade-offs. But what are they gonna not do, right, when you're asking them to take on um, additional work? And so, you know, that's, I think, key to prioritization. And so from there, you know, the other kind of language that you develop at an engineer developer level is kind of some basic threat modeling to say, okay, some vulnerability comes in, so what? Like, will a threat actor care to exploit it? Why would they be motivated to exploit it? And if they do exploit it, what can they do with that? Um, and what's the impact? And you start having these conversations, people develop that language, and people start talking in this way. And then when you're asking, work to be done, or we need to address this faster than something else, and these trade-offs make sense, um, those conversations tend to go very well because you're not just saying like, hey, something came in, we got to fix it. You can describe from you just have to think about it like an adversary. And I remember, kind of going back to like, I just love learning how things work, really understand how threat actors work. Nerd out on the MITRE ATT&CK framework, right? At a very technical level, you're basically understanding what might happen, how it might happen, to then justify we need to do this sooner versus later. Um, and then when you boil that up to a business context, you can say, okay, here's why we need to worry about these controls being, not as mature as we want them to be, and here's why we're okay with some of these other things. We can live with that for some time. Um, so yeah, I think you need to be technical and start at that level, and really understand how threat actors work, why they might want to do something, and why that applies to your specific environment and situation. I yeah, I think through like countless conversations about this notion of why is this a big deal versus not.
Yep.
And at the same time too, ideally you always want to have some, if you think about like if a group has almost like some chunk of bandwidth, right, of security things they're doing, you always want to have some slice of it that's like not the highest priority things. So you're always working through those kind of backlog items. Um, but I think having that understanding is helped me a lot. Have these conversations, and because people want to know like why are we doing this and
Mm-hmm.
why, and it usually comes back to well, this could be easily exploitable and it would have a big impact for us. Or like or there's a compliance implication. Again, you can't just like look at one or the other. Um, so yeah, that's been my approach to, say like why we should worry about some things, not the other, and connect that to uh this is how we're going to get though to a better state over time, right? So you're not
Yeah.
just like talking about it, yeah. Like today this makes sense, and we think how, and I always use the term investments, right? This is how we think our investments will change over time. And that aligns to the business and the business strategy um, in this way.
This was a perfect segue into the next part of this question. And I'll get there in a second, but what you're describing makes perfect sense. And I think all of us as practitioners, attempt to apply that sort of that logic to what it is that we do. Know your adversary, understand how that relates to your business and your assets. But there's another thing. There's another thing that sits on top of that, and you said it without using the word. Um, like at AttackIQ, we talk constantly about exposure management, the
Mhm.
concept of exposure, and how to define and measure exposure, and essentially what that means. Um, we're all super hyphy these days about C10, right? Like C10 is a framework, to me anyway, is the first framework to come along in a while that is it is just a visual manifestation and a reference architecture for what I would like to consider to be common sense.
Yeah.
Um, but to essentially look at that thing in a phased approach and say, I know my assets, right?
Yeah.
Square number one, scope. I know my assets. Number two, um, I have a way by which to prioritize amongst assets include up to and including all the problems that those assets might have, be it vulnerabilities or configuration errors or whatever it is. And not only that, but then I'm able to validate that my prioritization is A, correct, and B, that my plan to address is going to work. And then I get to mobilize, right? I get to go enact change. I get to go and measure the effectiveness and efficiency of the changes that I made in my environment, because now they're based on prioritization and a validated risk, and life is good. So CTEM is a really good framework to help essentially think the exact way you just explained right there. And I'm almost answering the question that I want to ask next, but obviously I'm here to get your perspective on it. So cool. We can have a rubric, we can have a framework, whatever, right? But as we know, tomorrow is not today, and the day after that will not be tomorrow, and so on and so forth. What I'm essentially getting at here is the risk landscape and the threat landscape never stops changing, moving, growing, shifting, whatever. So being able to prioritize is important. Being able to prioritize continuously is a whole different tin of beans. Essentially, what we want to be doing, my opinion, is creating and living in a feedback loop.
Yeah.
Where we're continually discovering and we're continually reevaluating and we're continually reprioritizing, and hopefully that's making us better continuously. So like, what are your thoughts on that? Like, how does one do the things that we're talking about in a continuous manner?
Yeah, I think the starting off, like, using automation as much as practically possible. And that'll give you like your, basic compliance, like, or posture management, patch compliance, detecting drift. And I always go back to like start basic. There's a lot of good native tools in like AWS or other cloud providers, and you can scale up from there. Um, but then, as much as possible, like, try to invest in that testing, like adversarial based testing, um, because some of these automated tools will kind of say whether you're good or bad from a, like, expected configuration, but that's still kind of theoretical, right?
Mm-hmm.
And again, you have to look at things from like multiple angles. Like, okay, that's good, but what will an attack probably look like? Um, and if I go somewhere, it's like one of the first things you want to do is do like a penetration test type assessment. Um, but you can't, it's really expensive to do that like at a high frequency. So trying to find ways to like have automation that's more advanced and try and like detect those things. Um, and that's, in terms of what's been deployed. And then also looking at it in your pipeline, your development pipeline of like what you're putting into the environment. Um, and so, there's also like leveraging your community. Um, a lot of times, and again, you can start basing and get more advanced, like vulnerability disclosure programs or building relationships in the community. Um, like you'll find people and insights that are, again, you're always forming this opinion of like, if you know what people can see from the outside and the techniques they're going to use, um, that's all input, right? For you to say, okay, like, um, yeah, these are the things I need to worry the most about. Um, there's so many ways to get that constant feedback. And, I always go back to like, there's no one perfect answer. Um, but as your budget changes and your resources change, that's how you kind of pick what makes sense for you as you're, evolving your program.
Yeah, 100%. Um, I am in no way affiliated with Gartner and CTEM as a framework, but I am a practitioner of CTEM as a framework, and the reason I think it's so effective is for a lot of the things you just talked about. Um, it it doesn't require you to do anything, but what it tries to sort of get you to do is A, think about things continuously. That's the whole
Yeah.
point, right? That's the C in C10. B, it encourages discovery, and it encourages discovery through the use of things like automation and so on and so forth, so that you're constantly rediscovering your world around you, and you're constantly comparing that to known threat. Um, and then obviously you as a practitioner has a whole other set of responsibilities around, like you said, sort of maintaining relationships in the industry when it comes to understanding threat, keeping abreast of changes in the world as it relates to threat actors and campaigns and so on. You mentioned MITRE ATT&CK before, friggin' awesome resource in the Center for
Yeah.
Threat Informed Defense, great resources. But all of this creates like forget complexity, right? Like it's beyond complexity at this point.
Yeah.
It's dynamic.
Yeah.
The problem space change, the threat landscape changes, the resource allocations change, vendor solutions break,
Yeah.
there's fire alarms. It's what we do. Um, and so like I like to use that word dynamic because it's not one aspect of change, it's all aspects of change all the
Yeah.
time. So like given that, right, given that problem with the dynamic nature of things, how do you remain effective across the whole stack without getting crushed by overhead or lack of effectiveness, while keeping in mind that the reason we're here is mature this program, make it more efficient, make it more capable, yada yada yada. Like what's that look like in your head?
Yeah. I think a big part of that, and this is sort of kind of, we were talking about the developing the language and, having these relationships, is really just understanding what the org is building and how they're, developing it. And over time, you kind of want to develop these security champions is sort of the term. Um, that lets you do two things. So you can influence how things are designed, which is really important. You can design things to be, for example, ephemeral versus long-term lasting data, um, you know, uh, immutable, right? And um, that's going to simplify your job a lot. And also being able to influence the design of systems, it's like you understand how these environments are changing and evolving. Um, with automated tools, like, yeah, it can be really like you get all this data, but you don't have a good picture in your mind of the higher level thing and how it's evolving. Um, so, being plugged into what's being designed, what's being shipped, trying to influence that, I think gives you those two benefits, that like you you're designing things to be secure from the get-go. Um, and by being involved in that process, you're getting that like feedback understanding of, what's it look like? How is it changing? Um, yeah, so that's sort of like the basic level. You have to be, I mean, for me anyways, it's like a previous engineer, like I just like, you know, being on the ground and understanding like, oh, why are we doing this thing? What's this new tech? Um, so that's understanding like your system, right? And how it's changing. Um, and then yeah, like, what uh what are the specific threats or compliance requirements that as that changes, where you invest in what you do changes as well. But if you have like, just a lot of like telemetry data coming in, a lot of stats, and um, it doesn't give you the best picture. So I think you have to start with the more fundamental kind of staying plugged into what's going on in the environment, um, as opposed to like trying to build a picture from like, some dashboard and a bunch of like metrics is that's not really uh helpful, right? So,
Yeah.
you know, yeah, you got to have this like high level understanding picture of your system. Then as you go, you fill it in with data and automation.
Yeah, for sure. So you said something there that I think is probably the most important thing that we've talked about so far, and that is um, being plugged into the production pipeline, being plugged
Yeah,
into technology and the business as a whole. I think this is an absolute understated thing for a million reasons, but primarily, um, and you mentioned some stuff about this earlier, when the security organization is seen as a gate or a
yeah,
bureaucratic entity, this does not bode well.
right.
You will never achieve your goals, and you will always be at odds with the goals of production, whatever we call
Yeah.
production. So there's ways to defeat that. Um, being plugged into the decision making, so to speak, where security is a consideration in the same way that a budget is a consideration and a language is a consideration and a deployment process or a deployment strategy is a consideration. Security is a fundamental consideration. Now, easier said than done, right?
Yeah.
Um, and I think the biggest thing that gets overlooked, and I've said this before, is security is a culture.
Yeah.
Um, and I get it. We always say like security is everybody's job, like
Yeah.
whatever, fine. But that's not a culture. That's more
Right.
of a mandate than it is anything else. A culture of security, a culture of like risk mindedness or security
Right.
consciousness or whatever you want to call it, is done through human interaction and words.
Yeah.
And I think it is, sharing your problem space, sharing problem
Yeah.
spaces.
Right.
Um, you know, being able to prioritize holistically instead of my priorities versus your priorities.
Right. Right.
Um, Educating people to understand the importance of risk management and prioritization and why it's bad when, this poor practice is implemented or shadow IT is all over the place or
Yeah.
whatever it is, right? I think that pays dividends more than any investment in any third-party security
Hmm.
technology or managed service provider or whatever. And I could go on and on about that all day, but like that's money right there, and it's free, quote unquote,
Yeah.
right? Um, all right, cool. To try and wrap all this up and bring it back to kind of why we're even talking about this and why we do what we do for a living. All that we talked about is all great, but how does any of it actually result in the reduction of risk? Like, how do we know? How do things like testing and validation and detection and all of those things, that are either CTEM focused or, MITRE ATT&CK Center for Threat Informed Defense focused or NIST focused, like whatever it is, like how does any of that actually result in a reduction of risk? And how do you know?
Yeah. I think that, starting with how do you know, right? Like, um, you have to, it's almost like you have a hypothesis of what you need to do. And when you're starting out, you kind of make smaller bets or smaller moves. It's like, okay, I think if we move in this direction and do this kind of thing, we're gonna, reduce these kind of risks. And then thinking through, well, how do I test that? Is it a penetration test? Is it an automated tool? How advanced does it need to be? So you keep, yeah, I like the concept of the OODA loop, right?
Mhm.
Observe, orient, decide, and act. Um, and yeah, you try and run through those loops as much as possible. And that the observation orientation is like, yeah, being plugged into, like I said before, what are the engineers working on? What trade-offs am I asking them to make? Where's the org in its maturity? Um, and then you're like, okay, based on that information, these kind of tests and assessments make sense. And just, always looking for the opportunities of how you can have these things performed. Um, but if you don't do that testing, and if that testing is not aligned to like your risk exposure and in terms of like what the organization is trying to do, um, that's not efficient testing either, right? So it's being able to say like we need to find about, these types of scenarios. And if we find about these scenarios, like this is a good investment because it's going to allow us to prioritize things more efficiently. So, everything's an investment. So when you're asking for like we should do these kind of tests, it's not just to do them, it's because it's going to help us, um, be effective with our user resources. And we haven't talked about the concept of assurance, right? It's really important. Like why do you think, we should be okay with where we are? Um, and you evolve it over time. Um, but you know, it's almost like it starts at the testing and assessment phase. Um, and the more detailed and representative of real world that is, the better. But you start kind of simple and basic, and then you scale up. You know, you hear things about like chaos, is it chaos engineering and
Yep.
those kind of more advanced things. Um, so if they're practical and cost effective ways of doing that, great. Um, but there's a bunch of ways of attacking it. I think it goes back to that notion of maturity level and um, yeah, how to get the most bang for buck. But you gotta constantly test your hypotheses of like, hey, I thought I was going to reduce this kind of risk by doing it this way, um, but it didn't play out. Let me change direction. I thought, uh, this would be operationally supportable, but it turns out it's not. Let me shift. So, it's got to be short loops and incremental
Yes.
moves. Because it's like if you're, like, oh, I'm going to build the biggest, fanciest thing right off the bat, it kind of goes back to the idea of like, well, that's not digestible. And you're making this like, I don't know, it's almost like a finance concept, right? The longer the term of like of an investment, it's like the kind of the higher risk if you're locking down resources into something. So if you keep it, these short, um, iterative, like you're testing a theory and you're evolving it, that also goes back to being efficient and you're being practical. So, that's how I try to and approach it. But it's like we really need to know what's going on. We can't, just follow a framework and think, oh, we're good. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. 100%. I mean, I think that sums it up there, right? Like the key to effective maturity and trajectory is, and the OODA loop is like the perfect way to conceive it, right? Um, it's hard to deal with the dynamic thing that we talked about when every movement is monolithic. Um, our jobs as leaders in the space is to be rapidly iterative,
yep.
and to consume information, digest information, and make decisions, and do that always.
Yeah.
Um, Fine-tuned, small steps
Yeah.
up and to the right means you're always moving up and to the right, right? And that
Right.
loop is essentially how you deal with setbacks and learn new things and discover what works and discover what doesn't work. I mean, no framework on the planet is going to tell you how to do that, right?
No.
Frameworks are in and of themselves monolithic, um, which again, not to overhype the CTEM thing, but I think that is the essence is that it's a tiny framework in the grand scheme of things. It's barely a framework. It's sort of a methodology, and it gives the ability to do that and to do it continuously. Small bits of improvement, discover constantly, make change that makes sense based on prioritization, always have an evolving picture of risk, et cetera, et cetera. So
Yeah.
cool. Awesome. One more question for you, and this is sort of just anecdotal. I like to ask it
Sure.
because I always have extremely polarizing things to say about this. So what role does the vendors play in this whole thing? I mean, today, what role do vendors play in this whole thing? And really, like, what would you like to see vendors doing?
Yeah. I think the best vendors relationships I've had is when it feels like it's like a partnership. I mean, obviously, like, their job is to sell, of course. But
Hmm.
if you it's that same thing. It's like, okay, here's someone that understands what I'm trying to do, my constraints, uh, and they're going to be mindful of, you're trying to be cost effective. And so I think trying to establish those, once you have that, you're confident that like there's a good alignment of interests, and what you're trying to do. Um, And then to the extent that products can then show your approach in terms of like, okay, I can demonstrate why, um, you know, what we're doing actually reduces risk. And then also that helps with your compliance requirements as well to say like, okay, this is how you're risk aligned. Um, but if you're able to talk to your vendors about like what you're trying to do, your mission, your constraints, and they get it, I think, it flows really well from there. And then to the extent the products can be, customized, like the really important thing is you can start with like kind of a coarse picture of a thing. So you're not overwhelmed with the detail, right? And having a way to uh, expand out or add more, signal as you fine tune. Sometimes like, it's just like on or off and you get
Mhm.
overwhelmed. Um, and then, also being mindful of kind of risk management type workflows where like, hey, if I am taking risk, if I am, uh, accepting an alert or exception, helping you keep track of that. So you can always come back to and say, well, maybe we should, revisit these things. Um, and I think also another thing is, what level of education they'll provide the operators, and that they also understand, you're asking people to do things. Um, how do you train those people to understand the tools, um, and get the most out of them? So yeah, just thinking back through like working with the vendors that I think have been the most helpful and effective is that type of partnership. But if you need to be able to talk about what the business is trying to do and where you are on that curve. Um, but that's what I look for in the most. Like when I find that it's like, yes, right.
Yep.
Um, and then being able to influence the project is huge too. And lucky to
100%.
have some of those relationships as well. So um,
Yeah,
yeah, that's what comes to
for
mind.
sure. Yeah, I always say, um, never trust a vendor who tells you they're going to solve all your problems without knowing what the problems are.
Yeah.
That's sort of my thing that I carry around, which is even weirder for me to say now that I'm on the vendor side. And believe me, I'm still struggling with this myself, but I stick to it. Anyway, awesome. Thanks so much. There are a
Yeah.
couple of questions, and I know we only got a couple of minutes, but I'm going to try and grab a couple that I think
Sure.
are good. I mean, this one's directed to me, and I feel like I need to answer it because it's a really great point and a really great question. So, I said in the boardroom, um, the ask is, well, how are we doing against our peers? Um, and I said, that's almost impossible to answer because I don't know. Um, so the question is essentially how much actual traction has that gotten over time, and where has it been more effective versus other metrics? So it's an interesting question because the answer to it is highly subjective. Um, it has everything to do with the organization you're in and what they value as far as what helps them sleep at night. And so if you work for Fidelity and they want to know how they stack up against Schwab, I mean, well, there's a couple of things you could do. Who's been in the headlines? Nobody?
Yeah.
Cool. They have SOC 2, they do SOC 1, like all of these
Right.
things, like, okay, we do that, we do that, we do that. So you're really just checking a box. Compliance is a way by which you could compare yourself to other peers in the industry. Is it effective versus literally any other metric? No. Um,
Yeah.
I think having a way to show, I'm not going to say it, but have a way to show that the resources that you spend are achieving a goal, and
Yeah.
that goal is business aligned. Those types of metrics and those types of metrics will be more effective than, hey, what's the neighbor doing as far as security any day of the week? My opinion.
Yeah. It puts you in a ballpark though, right? So,
Sure.
I always say like it's not one or the other. So I think it's good just to see like maybe I'm way off, but if that's your only kind of input to the thing, um, it again, like every context in the org is different, right? So
Yep.
you always have to plug that into your strategy of what you're
Yeah.
doing. So um it's interesting, but you really can't stop there.
Yeah. Agreed. One more because I think this is a good
Sure.
question. And then we'll get out of here. Um, So thoughts on the validity or long-term value of a risk register regarding prioritizing spend. As a risk register requires constant revision, this then requires constant conversations, which itself can be a challenge. Yeah, I mean, fantastic observation and a good question. What do you think, Dan?
Yeah, I think it's going back to understanding what the business cares about. Like you can have these risk registers with like 1,000 lines and they're like, kind of abstract and, it's hard to have a kind of clear picture. But if you can distill it down to like, these are the scenarios that if something were to actually happen, like that's a really bad day. Like this would actually impact our mission. Like, and always try to boil it down to like the most important you know, uh, things that are really gonna, mess up your day, basically. Um,
Hmm.
so I think they're good. I think they're a way to like frame discussions and have conversations. And there's a lot of like do the risk impact um type of like levers do they make the most sense? And just like any framework, they can be helpful, but you just can't like focus in on those mechanics too much because again, you're talking about why am I doing something versus not the other thing. And so
Yeah,
if you keep that core conversation in mind, you can use lots of different frameworks. You can get like super quantified and like boil it down to, value at risk, or you can just have like really simple conversations. But um, from my experience, like trying to keep that as simple, kind of macro level as possible. So you have like this huge register, and then you have lower, or higher levels of details like beneath that. But you got to start with like a macro view and have those conversations
yeah,
and not get too tied up on like the too much on the mechanics, but you're just trying to like structure the conversation as opposed to the goal is not to have a risk register. Like
right.
the goal is to just have good conversations and trade-offs about what you're doing and why.
Yeah, like going back to the very beginning, like all security programs start as a series of spreadsheets up to and including a risk register. My problem with risk registers historically, and I think this is what's starting to change in the industry now a lot, and we'll see a lot more talk about it, is a risk register is not continuous.
Yeah,
I'm saying that to be extremely polarizing. Um, like the continuous understanding of risk and threat and all of these things, if the method by which you're doing that is producing a consumable outcome, then the risk registry thing doesn't matter anymore. It winds up looking somewhat antiquated. I think the goal to achieving efficiency in trying to describe the picture of risk is to be doing it, like we said before, continuously in small bites and have that sort of be this ever evolving feedback loop. Um, because you know how risk registers go. Like you said, they get to be 1,000 lines. They go on a
yeah,
shelf. They literally get printed and put in a binder in somebody's desk drawer, and you blow the dust off of them maybe
right.
once a year. It's hard to have a risk register be continually evolving and also sort of feeding prioritization and direction to a security program, unless you've got some way to make it extremely dynamic and extremely automated and continual and so on and so forth. Anyway, we are over time. I just want to thank Dan a ton. Like this was a really great conversation. I appreciate you taking time out of your day to come hang out with us and talk shop.
Yeah, it's a lot of fun. And I hope people can walk away with some kind of base principles or first principles of how to think about this stuff. It's really complicated, but start with those fundamentals and then build the details around that as opposed to getting, too caught up on the implementation details and mechanics. And I think that'll give you a ton of mileage. And you'll always have like this sort of conceptual, North Star and framework for what you're doing. And
Yep,
and and those things don't change too much. Just kind of
100%.
make it more complex and detailed as you go on.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thanks a ton for the insight. I certainly got a lot out of this. I hope everybody else did. And we'll see you all again in December when we start to talk about our predictions for 26. And we have some very interesting guests on that episode. So we'll see you all then. Again, thank you very much, Ann. Thanks, Liz, for facilitating. We'll see everybody later.
All right. Thanks. See ya.
Take care, man.